In the stillness of that remote farm, a scream pierced the air. Help! It was a blind farmer, surrounded by strange men. But no one could have guessed what the trained horse did next. A reaction so unbelievable, it changed everything. Watch until the end and subscribe to the channel, because this story will hit you right in the feels from start to finish. The morning light crept over the Montana plains, washing over acres of untamed grassland that had belonged to the Foster family. For 5 generations, Jackson Foster hadn't seen this sunrise with his eyes in nearly 15 years, but he could feel its warmth on his weathered face as he stood on the porch of the farmhouse his great-grandfather had built with his own hands. "Ready for our rounds, Thunder?" Jackson asked, his voice a low rumble that seemed to match the vastness of the Big Sky country stretching out before him. The chestnut quarter horse nickered softly in response, moving alongside the porch with practiced ease. Thunder wasn't just any horse. He had been Jackson's companion since the darkness had settled permanently over his world. When the accident at the mill had taken his sight, Jackson had thought his days of working the land were over. It was Thunder who had given him his independence back. Jackson descended the steps with confidence, his movements assured despite his blindness. His calloused hand found Thunder's mane, and he pulled himself onto the saddle with the muscle memory that comes from a lifetime spent on horseback. The leather creaked beneath him, familiar and comforting. "Let's check the north pasture first," he said, and Thunder responded to the gentle pressure of his knees, turning without hesitation. Jackson Foster was a legend in Whispering Pines County. Locals still told stories about how he had adapted after losing his sight, training Thunder to be more than just a mount. The horse had become his eyes, his compass, his guardian. Together they managed the Foster Heritage Ranch with an efficiency that astounded even the most experienced ranchers in the valley. Thunder moved with purpose across the land, navigating rocky outcroppings and stream beds with care. Jackson's hand rested lightly on the horse's neck, reading subtle changes in muscle tension that told him more about their surroundings than any words could. They had developed a language all their own, built on trust and countless hours of patient work. But this morning, something felt different. The air carried a tension that Jackson couldn't quite place. Thunder's movements were slightly more alert, his ears flicking back and forth with greater frequency. "What is it, boy?" Jackson murmured, leaning forward in the saddle. The wind changed direction, bringing with it the distant sound of a vehicle's engine, unusual this deep into his property. The Foster Ranch was isolated by choice, with the nearest neighbor miles away and the small town of Whispering Pines a good 30-minute drive down dirt roads. Jackson had been expecting trouble. For months now, Horizon Development had been buying up ranches throughout the county. What started as whispers at the general store had grown into a full-blown controversy. Promises of economic revival clashed with concerns about environmental impact and the loss of a way of life that had defined this part of Montana for generations. 3 days ago, Mason Clark, Horizon's smooth-talking representative, had visited Jackson's ranch. Despite his blindness, Jackson could picture the man perfectly. Expensive suit out of place among the hay bales, city shoes collecting dust, and a smile that didn't match the coldness in his voice. "Mr. Foster, I'll be direct. Horizon is prepared to offer you 3 times the market value for this property. It's more money than you could make in 20 years of ranching." Jackson had remained silent, his unseeing eyes fixed in the direction of Clark's voice. "I understand. Your attachment to this place," Clark had continued, his tone suggesting he understood nothing of the sort. "But you have to consider practicalities. A man in your condition—" "My condition," Jackson had interrupted, his voice quiet but sharp as a newly honed blade. "My condition is that I'm the owner of this land, Mr. Clark. Land that my family has worked for over 100 years. Land that will still be Foster land long after your company has moved on to the next opportunity." Clark had left with promises to return with a better offer, but the threat in his parting words hadn't been lost on Jackson. "Everyone sells eventually, Mr. Foster. The smart ones just do it on favorable terms." Since then, small incidents had begun to plague the ranch. A fence cut here, a gate left open there, nothing that could be definitively tied to Horizon, but the timing was suspicious. Jackson had mentioned his concerns to Sheriff Emma Lawson during her weekly visit, but without proof there was little she could do. As Thunder carried him toward the north pasture, Jackson's thoughts were interrupted by the horse's sudden halt. Thunder's muscles tensed beneath him, and a tremor ran through the animal's powerful frame. "Easy," Jackson soothed. But the quarter horse remained rigid, his breathing becoming more labored. Jackson focused, filtering through the sounds around him. The whisper of grass in the morning breeze, the distant call of a meadowlark, and then footsteps, multiple sets, trying to move quietly but unfamiliar with how sound carried across open land. "Who's there?" Jackson called out, his voice carrying authority despite the knot of apprehension forming in his stomach. Silence answered him, but Thunder's increasing agitation told Jackson all he needed to know. Someone was there watching, waiting. He turned the horse, intending to head back to the main house where he could call Emma, but Thunder balked, refusing to move in that direction. "All right, boy, what's the play?" Jackson murmured, trusting the animal's instincts. Without warning, Jackson felt the earth shift beneath him as Thunder reared slightly and then surged forward. The sudden movement nearly unseated him, but decades in the saddle kept him firmly in place as Thunder galloped across the pasture. The sounds of pursuit confirmed his suspicions. Men shouting, the crunch of boots on dry grass, a vehicle engine roaring to life. Thunder's pace increased, his powerful legs eating up the distance as he carried Jackson away from danger. They crested a small rise, and Thunder slowed just enough for Jackson to hear the unmistakable sound of a camera shutter clicking rapidly. Photographers? Why would Horizon send photographers onto his property? The realization hit him like a physical blow. They weren't just trespassing, they were documenting, looking for weaknesses, for evidence that a blind man couldn't properly maintain a ranch of this size, creating a narrative that could be used against him if he continued to refuse their offers. Thunder surged forward again, seemingly aware of the urgency of their situation. They needed witnesses, documentation of their own. The town council meeting was happening this morning, ranchers and townsfolk gathering to discuss Horizon's growing influence in the county. "The meeting, Thunder," Jackson said, leaning low over the horse's neck. "Take us to town." As if understanding every word, Thunder adjusted course, heading for the eastern boundary of the property. The horse knew the way, though it had been years since they had made the journey together. Before Jackson's sight had failed him, they had regularly attended the seasonal gatherings in Whispering Pines. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit faded, but Jackson knew this wasn't over. Horizon wouldn't give up easily, not with billions in potential development at stake. What had begun as pressure tactics had escalated to intimidation, and Jackson couldn't help wondering how far they would go. Thunder's hooves thundered across the open grassland, his powerful stride unwavering despite the distance they needed to cover. The wind rushed past Jackson's face, carrying with it the scents of sage and wildflowers. In this moment, racing across the land he loved with Thunder as his guide, Jackson felt a fierce clarity. This wasn't just about him or even just about his family's legacy. This was about a way of life, about what happened when tradition collided with progress, when the value of land was measured in dollars rather than in generations of stewardship. If Horizon succeeded in pushing him out, others would follow. The character of Whispering Pines County would be forever altered. As they approached the eastern fence line, Jackson felt Thunder gather himself for the jump. They cleared it cleanly, landing on the public access road that would lead them to town. Thunder's pace steadied, settling into a ground-covering gallop that he could maintain for miles. Jackson's thoughts turned to his estranged sister, Sarah. They hadn't spoken in 12 years, not since their father's will had left the ranch solely to Jackson. Sarah had wanted to sell even then, to take the money and invest in her art gallery in Bozeman. Their argument had torn the last remnants of their relationship apart. The irony wasn't lost on Jackson that he was now racing toward the town where Sarah served as council president. Would she even help him after all this time? Or would she see this as vindication, proof that he should have sold years ago? Thunder's rhythmic strides carried them closer to Whispering Pines and to answers that would reshape not just the Foster legacy, but the future of an entire community. Jackson leaned forward, his hand buried in Thunder's mane, his face set with determination. "Whatever happens," he whispered to the loyal animal beneath him, "we face it together." The community, all in Whispering Pines, was buzzing with tension. Wooden folding chairs creaked under the weight of weathered ranchers and concerned business owners, all gathered to discuss the growing controversy surrounding Horizon Development's aggressive expansion. Sarah Foster stood at the podium, her tailored blazer and confident posture a stark contrast to the casual attire of most attendees. At 42, she had become the youngest council president in the county's history, building a reputation as a fair but progressive leader who believed that change, when managed properly, could benefit everyone. "The fact remains," she said, her voice carrying easily through the room, "that many of our local businesses are struggling. Horizon's proposal includes infrastructure improvements that would benefit the entire community, not just those who choose to sell their land." From the back row, Emma Lawson, the county sheriff, watched with a frown creasing her forehead. She'd known Sarah since high school, had watched the rift between her and Jackson grow from a crack to a canyon. Emma understood both siblings, Sarah's desire to see the town thrive and Jackson's commitment to preserving their heritage. "And what about water rights?" called out Walter Simmons, an elderly rancher whose property bordered Jackson's to the south. "Once they start diverting for that golf course and those fancy houses, what happens to the rest of us?" Sarah opened her mouth to respond when a commotion at the entrance drew everyone's attention. Thunder's distinctive whinny cut through the murmur of voices, followed by the sound of heavy hooves on the wooden porch of the community hall. The tired double doors swung open, and there stood Jackson Foster, one hand braced against the doorframe, the other still clutching Thunder's reins. His clothes were dust-covered, his face wind-burned from the hard ride. Despite his unseeing eyes, he seemed to survey the room, his head turning slightly as he registered the sudden silence. "Jackson!" Sarah's voice cracked with surprise and something deeper, a reflexive response to seeing her brother for the first time in over a decade. Emma was on her feet immediately, moving toward Jackson. "What happened?" "Trespassers on my land," Jackson said, his voice steady despite his labored breathing. "At least 4 men. They were documenting something near the old stable. Thunder brought me here." The crowd erupted in overlapping voices. Emma raised a hand, silencing them with the authority her position commanded. "You rode all the way from the ranch?" she asked, placing a supportive hand on Jackson's arm. "Thunder knew the way," Jackson replied simply, as if that explained everything. To those who knew the bond between man and horse, perhaps it did. Sarah had gone pale, her knuckles white where they gripped the edges of the podium. "Are you hurt?" The question hung in the air, weighted with years of unspoken words and festering resentments. Jackson turned toward his sister's voice, his expression unreadable. "No," he finally answered, "but they will be back. This wasn't random. They came prepared." Walter Simmons pushed to his feet, his weathered face flushed with anger. "This is exactly what I've been saying. First, they make offers no one can refuse. Then they start with the accidents and the threats. It's Happening all over again, just like with the Mitchell property last year. A murmur of agreement rippled through the room. The Mitchell case had been controversial. A family forced to sell after a series of unexplained equipment failures had left them unable to harvest their crops. "Those are serious allegations, Walter," Sarah said, her professional demeanor reasserting itself. "We can't accuse Horizon without evidence." "Evidence?" Jackson's voice cut through the tension. "You want evidence, Sarah? Send someone to my north pasture. They'll find plenty of evidence of trespassing. But that's not why I came." He took a breath, visibly steadying himself. "I came because whatever our differences, this affects all of us. The documents they're looking for on my land could impact every water right in this county." The room fell silent again, all eyes moving. Between the estranged siblings, Sarah's expression shifted from professional detachment to confusion. "What documents?" Jackson hesitated, clearly weighing how much to reveal in such a public forum. "Dad always said our land held secrets worth more than money." "I think I know what he meant now. There's an old sealed well near the north stable. It was part of the original homestead, long before our great-grandfather built the main house." Emma stepped closer. "What are you saying, Jackson?" "I'm saying that Horizon isn't just after developable land. They're after water, the underground aquifer that feeds half the county. And I believe there are original water rights documents sealed in that well that could stop them from redirecting it." The revelation sent another wave of murmurs through the crowd. Water was everything in Montana, the lifeblood of ranches and farms alike. Rights established in the territorial days took precedence over all others, and such documents would be worth millions in the right circumstances. Sarah stepped out from behind the podium, moving slowly toward her brother, as if approaching a wild animal that might bolt at any sudden movement. "Why didn't you tell me about this before?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jackson's laugh was hollow. "When, Sarah? During one of our many conversations over the past 12 years, or maybe at Dad's funeral, when you made it clear that the ranch was nothing but a burden. To you?" The hurt was raw in his voice, matched by the flash of pain that crossed Sarah's face. The assembled townsfolk watched in uncomfortable silence, witnesses to a family wound being laid bare in public. Emma cleared her throat. "I'll drive out to the ranch now, document whatever evidence those trespassers left behind." "I'll come with you," Walter offered, already buttoning his coat. "So will I," came another voice, then another. Soon half the room had volunteered to return to the Foster Ranch with Jackson. Sarah watched this rally of support with complex emotions playing across her face. Pride in her community's solidarity warred with shame at her own absence from her brother's life. Professional concerns about her position as council president clashed with the deep-rooted instinct to protect her family. "The council meeting will reconvene tomorrow," she announced, making a swift decision. "I need to see these trespassers. Tracks for myself." Jackson's head turned sharply in her direction, surprise evident in his expression. "You're coming too?" "It's still half my heritage, Jackson, even if I chose a different path." The tension between them was palpable. Years of hurt and misunderstanding compressed into a single moment of unexpected reunion. But beneath it all, something fundamental remained: the shared blood, the common history, the land that had shaped them both, regardless of how far Sarah had tried to distance herself from it. As the group prepared to depart, Thunder remained, vigilant at Jackson's side, sensing the importance of the moment. The horse's intelligent eyes followed Sarah as she approached her brother cautiously. "Your horse," she said, her voice softer now, private despite the crowded room. "He found his way to town after all these years." Jackson's hand moved to Thunder's neck, fingers threading through the coarse mane with familiar affection. "He remembers what matters." The simple statement carried the weight of their shared past, a gentle rebuke and an invitation wrapped in 5 quiet words. Outside, vehicles were being readied for the journey back to Foster Ranch. Emma organized the impromptu convoy, her sheriff's instincts taking over as she assigned people to different cars. "You'll ride with me," she told Jackson firmly. "Thunder can follow in Walter's trailer. He's earned a rest after that run." But Jackson shook his head. "I ride with Thunder or not at all. He knows what to look for better than any of us." Emma started to protest, but stopped when Sarah stepped forward. "I'll drive alongside them, close enough to watch out for them, far enough not to spook the horse." The offer surprised everyone, not least Jackson himself. After a moment's hesitation, he nodded his agreement. As they prepared to leave, Mason Clark's sleek black SUV pulled up in front of the community hall. The Horizon representative stepped out, his expression shifting from confidence to confusion as he took in the gathered crowd and the obvious preparations for departure. "Council President Foster," he called, spotting Sarah. "I thought we had a follow-up meeting scheduled for after the council session." Sarah turned, her spine straightening as she adopted her official role once more. "Circumstances have changed, Mr. Clark. Trespassers were spotted on private property this morning, property that your company has been particularly interested in acquiring." Clark's surprise appeared genuine. "I assure you, Horizon Development operates with the highest ethical standards. If someone trespassed on Mr. Foster's land, they weren't doing so under our direction." "Then you won't mind if we investigate thoroughly," Emma interjected, stepping forward with the full authority of her position, "including getting warrants for any recent communications between Horizon and its contractors regarding the Foster property." A flicker of something, concern, calculation, or perhaps both, crossed Clark's features before his professional smile reasserted itself. "Of course not, Sheriff. Horizon has nothing to hide. In fact, I'd like to join your convoy if that's acceptable. If someone is acting improperly while claiming to represent our interests, we want to know about it as much as you do." The offer created a moment of uncertainty among the group. Jackson's face darkened with suspicion, but before he could object, Sarah spoke. "That seems reasonable," she said, though her tone suggested she was far from convinced of Clark's innocence. "You can ride with me." "Sarah," Jackson began, a warning in his voice. "I know what I'm doing," she cut him off, a flash of the old determination that had driven her to leave the ranch and forge her own path in the world. Some things are better kept close at hand. As the unlikely procession prepared to depart, ranchers and townspeople, the estranged siblings, a cautious sheriff, and a corporate representative with uncertain motives, Thunder stood steady beside. Jackson, a silent guardian whose actions that morning had set in motion events that would reshape the future of Whispering Pines County. Jackson mounted with practiced ease, settling into the saddle that had become a second home. "Stay close," he told Sarah, his voice carrying both instruction and a tentative olive branch. "I will," she promised, and for the first time in 12 years, the Foster siblings moved in the same direction, bound by blood and history, and the land that had both divided and connected them across the painful years of silence. The convoy wound its way along the dusty roads leading to Foster Ranch, with Jackson and Thunder setting a steady pace at the front. Sarah's SUV followed close behind, her passenger Mason Clark unusually silent as he watched the blind rancher navigate with uncanny precision. "It's remarkable," Clark finally said, breaking the tense silence that had filled the vehicle since their departure from town. "The way he rides, you'd never know he can't see." Sarah's hands tightened on the steering wheel. "Jackson has always had a way with horses, even before the accident, but with Thunder, it's different. It's like they share a mind sometimes." "And you?" Clark asked, his voice carefully neutral. "Did you also have this connection with the land?" Sarah's laugh held little humor. "I was always more interested in what lay beyond the fence line. My father called me restless. Jackson called me selfish." "And what did you call yourself?" The question caught her off guard. She glanced at Clark, trying to assess his motivation for asking, but his expression remained professionally pleasant. "Practical," she finally answered. "The ranch was bleeding money by the time my father passed. Jackson refused to modernize or diversify. I wanted to sell then, use the money to secure both our futures. He wanted to preserve something that was already dying." "And now?" Clark pressed. 12 years later, do you still think selling is the practical choice?" Sarah fell silent, her eyes fixed on Thunder's powerful hindquarters as the horse carried her brother across the familiar terrain. Before she could formulate an answer, they crested a rise, and the Foster Ranch spread out before them, a sprawling property of rolling pastures, weathered outbuildings, and the sturdy two-story farmhouse that had stood for over a century. "It's beautiful," Clark murmured, and for once his corporate polish fell away, revealing what seemed like genuine appreciation. "Yes," Sarah agreed softly, "it always was." The convoy followed Jackson to the main house first, vehicles pulling into the gravel driveway and parking in a loose semicircle. Emma immediately took charge, organizing the volunteers into search parties to document any evidence of trespassing. "Walter, take 4 people and check the fence line along the north boundary," she directed. "Look for tire tracks, footprints, anything that shouldn't be there. Harrison, you and your boys check the outbuildings. If someone's been snooping around, they'll have left traces." As the groups dispersed, Jackson dismounted, his movements fluid despite his blindness. Thunder stood protectively at his side, the horse's eyes tracking Sarah as she approached her childhood home for the first time in over a decade. "It looks exactly the same," she said, taking in the wraparound porch with its familiar rocking chairs, the blue paint faded but still clinging to the window frames, the old wind chime their mother had hung, still tinkling softly in the breeze. "Some things don't need changing," Jackson replied, his voice neither accusatory nor welcoming, just stating a fact as he perceived it. Emma joined them, her notebook already in hand. "Jackson, I need you to walk me through what happened this morning. Every detail you can remember." As Jackson recounted the events, Mason Clark hovered at the periphery, his attention seemingly divided between the conversation and the expansive property surrounding them. His eyes lingered on the distant hills that marked the property's boundary, then shifted to the cluster of outbuildings to the north. "This well you mentioned," Emma said once Jackson had finished his account. "The one with the documents. Where exactly is it located?" Jackson turned, orienting himself by the feel of the sun on his face and the subtle sounds of the ranch. "About half a mile north of here, near the old stable. It's been sealed for as long as I can remember, but Dad always made a point of showing it to me when we rode that way. Said it was part of what made our water rights special." "And you think that's what these trespassers were looking for?" Emma pressed. "How would they even know about it?" Jackson's expression darkened. "Someone's been doing their homework, land surveys, historical records. If you dig deep enough, there are mentions of an unusual water source on the original homestead papers." "Mr. Foster," Clark interjected, stepping forward with the confident air of someone used to controlling conversations. "I assure you that while Horizon has conducted standard due diligence regarding properties in the area, we have no interest in illegal activities. If someone is trespassing on your land claiming to represent us, save it," Jackson cut him off, his voice sharp. "I don't need eyes to recognize a snake oil salesman when I hear one." Clark's professional veneer cracked for an instant, a flash of annoyance crossing his features before he composed himself. "I understand your suspicion, but I'm here in good faith. If there's been any impropriety, Horizon wants it addressed as much as you do." "We should check the well site," Sarah suggested, diffusing the tension. "If that's where the trespassers were headed, we might find more evidence there." Emma nodded in agreement. "I'll get a forensic kit from my vehicle." "Jackson, is there a way to access this sealed well?" "Dad used to say there was a key," Jackson replied, though I never saw him use it. Something about it being hidden in plain sight where only a foster would think to look. Sarah's brow furrowed. That sounds like Dad's cryptic nonsense. He always did love his little mysteries. Despite her dismissive words, there was a fondness in Sarah's voice that hadn't been there earlier. Memories were stirring, pulling her back to a childhood spent exploring every inch of this land alongside her brother. The weather vane, she said suddenly, her eyes widening. Remember the old weather vane on top of the stable? Dad used to tell us that story about great-grandfather crafting it himself with a special compartment inside the arrow. Jackson's expression shifted, surprise giving way to recognition. I'd forgotten that. We used to climb up there as kids, pretending we were looking for pirate treasure. We need to check it, Sarah insisted, already moving toward the vehicles. If there's a key, that's where Dad would have hidden it. The small group made their way to the north stable, a weathered structure that had seen better days but remained sturdy in its essential construction. Thunder followed close behind Jackson, occasionally nudging him gently to guide his steps around obstacles. The ancient weather vane atop the stable roof creaked as it turned in the light breeze, its copper surface green with age. The Foster family crest, a simple design of mountains and flowing water, was still visible at its base. I'll go up, Sarah volunteered, already examining the side of the building for the ladder they had used as children. It's not there anymore, Jackson told her. Rotted away years ago. There's a proper ladder in the tack room now. Harrison, one of the local volunteers, fetched the ladder and secured it against the side of the stable. Sarah kicked off her city shoes and climbed with the confidence of someone returning to a skill never quite forgotten. When she reached the peak of the roof, she carefully made her way to the weather vane. It's still here, she called down, her fingers tracing the familiar shape of the Foster crest. The compartment in the base, I can feel the seam. The group below watched as she manipulated the weather vane, working from memory of adventures long past. With a soft click, a small compartment opened, and Sarah extracted something that glinted in the sunlight. I've got it, she called, her voice animated with the thrill of discovery. It looks like an old skeleton key. As Sarah made her way back down the ladder, excitement pulsed through the gathered group. Even Mason Clark seemed genuinely intrigued, his corporate demeanor momentarily forgotten as he watched this chapter of local history unfold. With the key in hand, they followed Jackson's directions to the sealed well. It was an unassuming structure, its stone circle rising only a foot above ground level, covered by a heavy iron lid that had been secured with a rusted lock mechanism that looked as old as the ranch itself. This is it, Jackson confirmed, his fingers running along the weathered stone. Dad always made a point of checking it whenever we rode this way, said it was the heart of the ranch in more ways than one. Sarah examined the ancient lock, then carefully inserted the key from the weather vane. For a moment, nothing happened, and disappointment began to settle over the group. Then, with a grinding sound that spoke of decades of disuse, the mechanism turned. It works, Sarah whispered almost to herself. It actually works. Together, she and Emma lifted the heavy iron cover. The scent of cool, damp air wafted up from the darkness below. Emma shone her flashlight down, revealing stone walls descending about 15 feet to a water surface that reflected the beam back like a mirror. There's a ledge about halfway down, she reported. Looks like a small alcove cut into the side of the well. That must be where the documents are, Jackson said. Dad always said they were kept dry, above the waterline, but hidden from casual discovery. I'll go, Emma volunteered, already securing a rope from her vehicle to the sturdy post beside the well. Sarah, hold the light steady for me. The sheriff descended carefully, her movements precise as she located the alcove and examined its contents. There's a metal box, she called up, sealed tight, but it looks intact. When Emma emerged from the well, the metal box clutched securely in her hands. A hush fell over the gathered crowd. It was a simple container made of copper with the same foster crest etched into its lid. Despite its age, it appeared remarkably well preserved, protected from the elements in its subterranean hiding place. "Should we open it here?" Emma asked, looking to Jackson as the property owner. Jackson hesitated, his unseeing eyes turning toward where his sister stood. "It belongs to both of us," he said finally. "It's the Foster legacy. Sarah should be part of this." The simple acknowledgement brought a flush to Sarah's cheeks. She moved closer, standing shoulder to shoulder with her brother for the first time in years. "Together then," she said softly. There was no lock on the box itself, just a simple latch that had been sealed with wax bearing the Foster crest. Emma carefully broke the seal and lifted the lid. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth that had preserved them remarkably well, lay a stack of documents. The topmost was yellowed with age, its handwritten text faded but still legible. A water rights certificate dated 1867, predating Montana's statehood, granting exclusive rights to the underground aquifer to the original Foster homesteader. "These are territorial rights," Emma breathed, her voice hushed with the significance of the find. "They supersede anything established after statehood. This isn't just about the Foster Ranch. This document affects water rights throughout the entire watershed." Mason Clark had gone very still, his eyes fixed on the ancient papers with an intensity that betrayed far more interest than professional curiosity. "May I?" he asked, reaching toward the documents. "No," Jackson and Sarah said in unison, their voices blending in shared protectiveness of their heritage. The moment of unity wasn't lost on either of them. Something shifted between the estranged siblings. Not forgiveness, not yet, but a recognition of the blood bond that still existed despite the years of silence. "These need to be properly documented," Emma said, gently returning the papers to their protective wrapping, "and secured. They're historically significant beyond just your family's interests." As Emma carefully repacked the box, Walter called out from where he'd been examining the area around the well. "Sheriff, you need to see this." The group moved to where Walter stood, pointing at fresh disturbances in the soil surrounding the Her. "Well, someone's been digging test holes," he explained, indicating several carefully refilled spots that would have been invisible to anyone who didn't know exactly what to look for. "Professional work too. Geological sampling, if I had to." "Guess." Emma knelt to examine the evidence, her expression grim. "Recent too, within the last few days." All eyes turned to Mason Clark, whose composed exterior had begun to show cracks. "I can't speak to what may have been done without proper authorization," he said, his voice slightly less smooth than before. "But I assure you, if Horizon employees have overstepped—" "This isn't about overstepping," Jackson interrupted, his voice quiet but carrying the weight of generations. "This is about trying to steal what can't be bought. My family has safeguarded this water source for over 150 years. It's not just our livelihood, it's our responsibility to everyone downstream." As the implications of the discovery settled over the group, Thunder moved to stand protectively at Jackson's side, the horse's intelligent eyes seemingly aware of the momentous nature of what had just occurred. Sarah watched. The pair, her blind brother and the horse that had become his eyes and guardian, with growing understanding of what she had walked away from all those years ago. It wasn't just land she had abandoned, but a legacy, a responsibility, a connection to something larger than herself. In the fading afternoon light, with the ancient documents secure in Emma's custody and the evidence of trespassing clearly documented, the Foster siblings stood united for the first time in 12 years, bound by blood, by memory, and by the land that had shaped them both in ways they were only beginning to fully comprehend. The kitchen of the Foster farmhouse hummed with activity as the afternoon stretched into evening. Emma had set up a makeshift command center at the worn oak table that had served generations of the family. The ancient water rights documents lay carefully protected in their box at the center, flanked by maps of the county and printouts of Horizon's development plans. These documents will need to be verified by the State Historical Society, Emma explained, but even preliminary examination confirms they're authentic. Territorial water rights from before statehood would supersede any modern claims. Jackson sat at his customary place at the head of the table, his fingers occasionally brushing over the embossed Foster crest on the copper box as if to reassure himself of its presence. Sarah moved around the kitchen with surprising ease, muscle memory guiding her as she prepared coffee for the assembled group. "I called Judge Patterson," Emma continued. "He's issued an emergency injunction preventing any development activities within the watershed area until the water rights issue can be fully adjudicated." Mason Clark had remained silent throughout much of the discussion, his earlier corporate confidence significantly diminished. "Horizon will contest this, of course," he finally said. "These documents may be historically interesting, but modern water use regulations—" "Save it, Clark," Walter interrupted. "Those territorial rights are ironclad. Your lawyers can fight it, but they'll lose. The real question is, who sent those men to trespass today, and what exactly were they looking for?" All eyes turned to the Horizon representative, whose discomfort was now plainly visible. "I've already placed calls to our head office," he said, shifting in his seat. "If any Horizon employees or contractors were involved in unauthorized activities, they will be held accountable." "Convenient," Emma remarked dryly. "But that doesn't explain how they knew about the well and its contents in the first place. That information wasn't in any public record." A heavy silence settled over the room, broken only by the soft whickering of thunder outside the kitchen window where the horse kept vigil. Jackson tilted his head, listening to something only he could hear in the animal's restless movements. "He's uneasy," Jackson murmured. "Something's still not right." Sarah moved to the window, peering out at the darkening landscape. "There's nothing out there that I can see." "Thunder sees more than you'd think," Jackson replied, rising from his chair with the practiced movements of a man who knows his surroundings intimately. "I need to check on him." As Jackson made his way to the back door, Sarah followed without hesitation, a protective instinct awakening after years of dormancy. Outside, Thunder paced along the fence line, his ears pricked forward toward the distant northern boundary of the property. "What is it, boy?" Jackson asked, approaching the agitated horse. Thunder calmed slightly at his touch, but continued to focus on something in the distance. Sarah scanned the horizon, squinting in the fading light. "There's a vehicle moving along the ridge," she reported. "Looks like, is that the Wilkins old truck?" Jackson's brow furrowed. "Ray Wilkins? His property borders ours to the north, but he sold to Horizon last year, moved to Arizona. Then who's driving his truck on your property?" Before Jackson could respond, Emma joined them, alerted by their rapid exit. "What's happening?" "Suspicious vehicle on the North Ridge," Sarah explained, pointing. "It shouldn't be there." Emma's hand moved instinctively to her service weapon. "Stay here. I'll take Harrison and check it out." "No," Jackson said firmly. "This is my land. I'm coming with you." "Jackson, be reasonable," Sarah began, concern evident in her voice. "It could be dangerous, and you—" "I know every inch of this property better than anyone," he interrupted. "And I have Thunder. You can come or stay, Sarah, but I'm going." The determination in his voice brooked no argument. Emma, recognizing the futility of debating with a Foster when their mind was made up, simply nodded. "Fine, but we do this carefully. And Clark comes too. I want to see his reaction when we find—" "Oh, who's up there?" Within minutes, some small group had assembled. Emma and Harrison in the lead, followed by Jackson on Thunder, Sarah in her SUV, and Mason Clark, who had protested but ultimately complied when Emma made it clear it wasn't a request. Walter and the remaining volunteers stayed behind to secure the documents and the farmhouse. As they approached the ridge, Emma signaled for everyone to cut their engines and lights. The distant vehicle was now clearly visible, parked near an outcropping that overlooked the valley, containing the sealed well. "Two figures," Emma murmured, studying the scene through binoculars. "They're setting up some kind of equipment. Surveying gear," Clark supplied, his voice tight. "Geological survey equipment, to be precise." Emma turned to him, her expression hard. "You want to explain how you recognize that so quickly, Mr. Clark?" Clark's professional demeanor cracked further. "I may have seen preliminary reports from similar surveys, but I assure you, if Horizon personnel are conducting unauthorized activities, save the corporate line," Emma snapped. "Those men are trespassing on private property and potentially tampering with critical water resources. That's a criminal matter now." She unholstered her weapon and spoke into her radio, calling for backup from her deputies. "We're going to approach carefully. Jackson, Sarah, you stay back until we secure the scene." But Thunder had other ideas. Perhaps sensing Jackson's tension or responding to some subtle cue, the horse suddenly surged forward, carrying Jackson toward the ridge at a controlled canter that nonetheless outpaced the others. "Jackson!" Sarah cried out, fear slicing through her as she watched her blind brother heading directly toward potential danger. What happened next would be recounted in Whispering Pines for years to come. As Jackson and Thunder crested the ridge, the two surveyors looked up in shock at the sight of a blind man on horseback, bearing down on them with unerring precision. One man bolted immediately, heading for their truck. The other froze, equipment still in hand. Thunder circled the remaining surveyor, creating a barrier between the man and his escape route. Jackson sat tall in the saddle, his unseeing eyes nonetheless conveying authority as they fixed in the direction of the trespasser. "This is Fosterland," Jackson's voice carried across the ridge. "You're not welcome here." By the time Emma and the others arrived, the scene was already under control. The fleeing man had been intercepted by Harrison, while the second surveyor remained effectively cornered by Thunder's intimidating presence. Sarah watched in amazement as her brother commanded the situation without a single misstep. Thunder, responding to the slightest pressure of knee or shift of weight, as if the two shared a single consciousness. It was both humbling and enlightening. A window into the life Jackson had built in her absence, the skills he had developed, the bonds he had formed. Emma made quick work of detaining the surveyors, securing their equipment as evidence. To everyone's surprise, the men carried Horizon Development Identification badges. "Well, Mr. Clark," Emma said, turning to the increasingly uncomfortable corporate representative, "it seems your assurances aren't worth much after all." Clark's face had gone pale. "I didn't know," he insisted, though his conviction sounded hollow even to his own ears. "The regional director must have authorized this without informing me. Or you were kept in the dark deliberately, meant to be the fall guy if things went south," Sarah suggested, her years in local politics having taught her how corporate accountability often worked. Either way, Horizon has some serious explaining to do. As Emma read the trespassers their rights and loaded them into her vehicle, Sarah approached her brother. Jackson had dismounted and now stood with one hand on Thunder's neck, the horse standing protectively close. "That was either the bravest or the most foolish thing I've ever seen," she said, unable to keep the admiration from her voice. Jackson's mouth quirked in a half-smile. "Thunder did all the work. He always knows what needs doing." In the gathering darkness, with the faint glow of emergency lights flashing across the landscape as Emma's deputies arrived, the Foster siblings stood silent for a moment, the years of separation temporarily forgotten in the wake of shared crisis. "You've done something remarkable here, Jackson," Sarah finally said, her voice soft but clear. "Not just preserving the land, but this connection with Thunder, with the ranch itself. I didn't understand it before." And now? The question carried the weight of 12 years of silence. Sarah looked out over the land that had shaped both their lives in such different ways. Now, I'm starting to see what Dad meant about some things being worth more than money. The ride back to the farmhouse was subdued, the adrenaline of confrontation giving way to weariness and the recognition that this battle, while important, was just the beginning of a longer struggle. The water rights documents would provide legal protection, but Horizon's resources and influence meant the fight was far from over. In the kitchen, Emma confirmed what they had already suspected. The surveyors had been conducting unauthorized geological assessments of the aquifer, documenting its extent and capacity for Horizon's development plans. They claimed they were just following orders, she reported. Standard corporate deniability, but they did confirm something interesting. Horizon has been specifically targeting properties above the aquifer. It's not just about building luxury homes, it's about controlling the water supply for the entire county. The revelation sent a wave of murmurs through the assembled group. Water had always been the most precious resource in Montana, but the idea that a corporation could effectively monopolize it by acquiring the right properties was chilling. That's why Dad was so adamant about holding on to the ranch, Jackson said, understanding dawning in his voice. He knew what was at stake even back then. Sarah nodded slowly. He tried to tell me, in his way. Said the land held values that couldn't be measured in dollars. I thought it was just sentimentality. As the evening wore on, plans were made and strategies discussed. The documents would need to be properly preserved and presented in court. Legal experts would need to be consulted. The community would need to unite against Horizon's pressure tactics. One by one, the volunteers departed, until only Jackson, Sarah, Emma, and a detained Mason Clark remained in the farmhouse kitchen. Clark had been uncharacteristically silent since the confrontation on the ridge, his corporate armor thoroughly cracked. What happens now? He finally asked, addressing the question to no one in particular. Now, Emma replied. You go back to your company and deliver a message. Horizon Development is under investigation for trespassing, attempted destruction of historical artifacts, and potential water rights violations. Any further activity in Whispering Pines County will be scrutinized under a microscope. Clark nodded, accepting the inevitable. As Emma escorted him to her vehicle for the drive back to town, Sarah and Jackson found themselves alone in the kitchen of their childhood home for the first time in over a decade. I should go too, Sarah said hesitantly. I've got an early council meeting tomorrow, and with all this new information, Jackson nodded, his expression unreadable. Then, with a slight clearing of his throat, he asked, Or you could stay. Your old room is still there. Nothing's changed. The simple offer hung in the air between them, carrying far more significance than its surface meaning. It wasn't just an invitation to spend the night. It was a tentative step toward bridging the chasm that had grown between them. Sarah looked around the kitchen, at the familiar copper pots hanging above the stove, the collection of pottery mugs their mother had made, the wooden calendar board, where their father had marked the seasons with careful precision. Nothing had changed, and yet everything had. I'd like that, she said softly. Thank you. Outside, Thunder moved restlessly in the paddock, his exceptional hearing picking up sounds beyond human perception. The horse had sensed the shifting dynamics within the farmhouse, the tentative reconnection between the siblings whose scents carried the same familial markers despite their years apart. As night settled fully over Foster Ranch, a peace descended that had been absent for too long. The battle for the land and its precious water was far from over, but for the first time in years, the Foster legacy stood united. A blind rancher, his estranged sister, and a remarkable horse whose actions had set in motion a healing that ran deeper than any underground spring. 3 months later, the community hall in Whispering Pines was once again filled to capacity, But the atmosphere could not have been more different from that tense morning when thunder had burst through the doors with Jackson clinging to his back. Today, there was an air of celebration, of community solidarity, of victory. Sarah Foster stood at the podium, no longer just as council president, but as a woman transformed by reconciliation and purpose. The tailored blazer remained, but the stiffness in her posture had softened, the professional distance replaced by genuine connection with the ranchers and townspeople who had united against Horizon Development's attempted takeover. The Montana Supreme Court's ruling is final, she announced, unable to keep the triumph from her voice. The territorial water rights documented in the Foster family papers are legally binding and extend protection to all properties within the watershed. Horizon's permits have been permanently revoked and their appeals exhausted. Applause erupted throughout the hall, none more enthusiastic than from the corner where Jackson sat. Thunder's lead rope looped loosely around his wrist. In the months since the discovery at the well, an exception had been made to allow the horse's presence at community gatherings, a recognition of the animal's pivotal role in preserving their way of life. Furthermore, Sarah continued once, the applause had subsided. The court has established the Whispering Pines Watershed Trust, granting legal protection to the aquifer for perpetuity. No single entity, corporate or individual, will ever be able to control or redirect this resource that belongs to all of us, just as the Foster family has maintained for generations. More applause followed, along with cheers and the stomping of boots on the wooden floor. Jackson's smile was quiet but deep. His unseeing eyes crinkled at the corners with a satisfaction that went beyond legal victory. After the formal announcements concluded, community members gathered in small groups, sharing coffee and Martha Johnson's famous apple pie while discussing the future, now secured, for their children and grandchildren. Emma Lawson moved through the crowd, no longer in crisis management mode, but celebrating alongside the people she had sworn to protect. "You did good, Jackson," she said, settling into a chair beside him. "Your father would be proud." Jackson nodded, emotion momentarily tightening his throat. "It wasn't just me, it was all of us, and Thunder," he added, reaching out to stroke the horse's velvet muzzle as the animal nudged his shoulder. "That's one special horse," Emma agreed. "The way he knew exactly where to go that day, how to get help, I've never seen anything like it." "We understand each other," Jackson said simply. "He sees for me, and I give him purpose. It works." Sarah approached, carrying coffee for her. Brother in the mug he preferred, the one with the chipped rim that he could identify by touch alone. Such small details had become important to her over the past months, discoveries and rediscoveries that bridged the years of separation. "Judge Patterson wants to talk to you about implementing the watershed monitoring program," she told Jackson, placing the mug in his outstretched hand with practiced ease. "He thinks Thunder's sensitivity to environmental changes could be valuable for the annual assessments." Jackson smiled. "Thunder, the official watershed guardian? Dad would get a kick out of that." The easy reference to their father, once a source of tension between them, now carried shared understanding rather than pain. The siblings had spent countless evenings in the farmhouse kitchen, gradually rebuilding their relationship through memories both difficult and cherished, finding a way forward that honored their father's legacy while respecting their individual paths. Walter Simmons hobbled over, his arthritis worse in the cooling autumn weather, but his spirit undimmed by age or hardship. "You Fosters always were too stubborn for your own good," he chuckled, "but thank heavens for it this time. Mark my words, 50 years from now, folks will still be telling the story of Jackson and his seeing-eye horse saving the county's water." Let's hope they remember Sarah's part too," Jackson countered, a note of pride in his voice. "Her legal knowledge put the final nails in Horizon's coffin." Sarah shook her head, though she couldn't suppress a pleased smile. I just connected. The right experts with the right documents. The community did the rest. As the celebration continued around them, the Foster siblings found a moment of quiet reflection amid the joyful noise. Sarah watched Thunder's careful movements around the crowded room, the way he positioned himself to guide Jackson safely through the space, anticipating obstacles and creating pathways with subtle shifts of his powerful body. "I've been thinking," she said, pitching her voice for Jackson's ears alone, "about my place in Bozeman." Jackson turned toward her, his expression questioning but patient. The months of reconciliation had taught them both to listen more carefully, to allow space for thoughts to be fully formed and expressed. "It's a good apartment," Sarah continued. "Nice neighborhood, convenient to the gallery. But it's never really felt like home, you know?" "And the ranch does?" Jackson asked, the question carrying no judgment, only genuine curiosity. Sarah looked around the community hall, at the faces of people who had stood with them against corporate interests, who had rallied around a blind rancher and his remarkable horse, who had recognized the value in preserving something precious even when economic pressures pushed toward development and change. "I think home might be somewhere in between," she admitted. "I'm not cut out for full-time ranch life, we both know that, but I've been looking at properties on the edge of town, places with enough land for a small stable." Understanding dawned on Jackson's face. "For Thunder's retirement years?" "And yours," Sarah added softly. "Eventually, not soon, but someday when managing the whole ranch becomes too much, a place where you could still have space and independence, but be closer to town resources." The suggestion hung between them, not a definitive plan but a tender acknowledgement of future possibilities, of shared responsibility, of family looking out for family in the ways that mattered most. After a moment, Jackson nodded, a subtle acceptance of this uncertain but hopeful future they were tentatively building together. "Thunder would enjoy having you around more regularly," he said. The words simple, but carrying layers of meaning. "He's gotten used to your voice again, and I've gotten used to his personality," Sarah replied with a laugh. "I never thought I'd miss the smell of horse in my clothes, but somehow—" Their conversation was interrupted by Emma, who approached with uncharacteristic excitement. "You two need to come outside. There's something you should see." Curious, the siblings followed her out onto the community hall porch, Thunder moving smoothly alongside Jackson. A small crowd had already gathered, gazing up at the clear autumn sky where a phenomenon was unfolding. "What is it?" Jackson asked, sensing the collective wonder but unable to perceive its source. "Wild horses," Sarah described, her voice filled with awe. "A herd moving along the ridge. They almost never come this close to town." On the distant hillside, silhouetted against the setting sun, a band of mustangs moved with fluid grace, manes and tails flowing in the wind as they traversed territory. Their ancestors had roamed for centuries before fences and property lines had divided the land. Their appearance near the town on this particular day seemed like nature's own acknowledgement of the victory for preservation over development. Thunder's ears pricked forward, his body tensing with recognition of his wild kin. He gave a soft whicker that carried across the evening air. To everyone's amazement, the lead stallion on the hillside paused, raised his head, and responded with a trumpeting call that echoed through the valley. "He's acknowledging Thunder," Walter murmured, his voice hushed with reverence for this moment of connection between domestic and wild, between present and past, between what had been preserved and what remained free. Jackson couldn't see the wild horses, but he felt Thunder's response, the subtle shifts in the animal's body that spoke of recognition and respect. He placed his hand on the horse's neck, feeling the powerful muscles beneath the smooth coat, the steady heartbeat that had guided him through darkness, both literal and figurative. "Dad used to talk about the wild herds," Jackson recalled, a voice soft with memory. said they were the spirit of Montana, the living embodiment of everything worth fighting for in this land. He was right, Sarah agreed, linking her arm through her brother's in a gesture that had become natural again over the past months. Some things can't be measured in dollars or development potential. As twilight deepened, the wild horses moved on, disappearing over the ridge like a vision from another time. The gathered townspeople returned to their celebration inside, but the Foster siblings remained on the porch a moment longer, savoring the quiet epilogue to their victory. "What happens now?" Sarah asked, echoing the question Mason Clark had posed that night in the farmhouse kitchen, but with an entirely different meaning. Jackson considered the question, his face turned toward the last warmth of the setting sun. "We keep going. We work the land, we protect what matters, just like the Fosters have always done." "Together," Sarah asked, the single word carrying the weight of past estrangement and future possibility. Jackson smiled, his hand still resting on Thunder's strong neck. "Together," he affirmed, "all three of us." Inside the community hall, plans were already being discussed for the first annual Watershed Festival, a celebration of the victory, but also an educational opportunity to help future generations understand the value of what had been preserved. Children clustered around Emma as she showed them the carefully restored territorial water rights documents, now encased in protective glass, but returned to the community where they belonged. As night fell fully over Whispering Pines, Jackson and Thunder made their way home with practiced ease, Sarah following in her vehicle. The lights of the farmhouse glowed welcomingly in the distance, a beacon guiding them back to the place where their story had begun, and now continued. Thunder moved with confidence through the darkness, carrying Jackson with the same care he had shown that desperate morning when he had raced to town for help. The bond between man and horse had been forged in necessity, but strengthened by something deeper. A mutual trust, a shared purpose, a connection that transcended ordinary understanding. The Foster Ranch would endure, as it had for generations before, its precious resources protected for generations to come. The remarkable story of a blind rancher and the horse who became his eyes would be told and retold throughout Whispering Pines County, growing perhaps in the telling, as such stories often do, but never losing the essential truth at its heart. That, sometimes, the most extraordinary vision comes not from what can be seen with the eyes, but what can be perceived with the heart. That loyalty and courage recognize no limitations, that the most valuable inheritances aren't measured in acres or dollars, but in purpose and connection and a deep, abiding love for the land that shapes us all. And that a horse, responding to some instinct beyond human comprehension, could guide a man through darkness to find not just help, but healing, for himself, for his sister, for a community threatened by forces that valued progress over preservation. Thunder had done more than save a ranch. He had reunited a family and protected a legacy that would now continue for generations to come. As the farmhouse drew nearer, its porch light a steady beacon in the Montana night, Jackson felt a profound sense of rightness settle over him. The path ahead would not always be easy, but it would be traveled together. Blind rancher, loyal horse, and a sister returned home. Different pieces of the same legacy, each with their unique strengths, united in purpose just as their ancestors had intended. "Almost home, Thunder," Jackson murmured, feeling the horse's stride lengthen subtly in response. Behind them, Sarah's headlights cast their elongated shadows forward, 3 silhouettes moving as one toward a future secured by courage, perseverance, and the unyielding bond between a man and the remarkable animal who had become not just his eyes but his heart's compass in a changing world. Dear listeners, we hope that Jackson and Thunder's extraordinary journey has touched your hearts as deeply as it has touched ours. The story of loyalty, family reconciliation, and the fight to preserve what truly matters reminds us all that sometimes our most powerful connections transcend words. For more emotionally captivating narratives like this one, we've created a special playlist you can find by clicking to your left. If you've enjoyed this tale of courage and connection, please don't forget to subscribe to our channel and like this video. Every day, we bring you unique stories that explore life's complexities and celebrate the bonds that define us. What was your favorite moment between Jackson and Thunder? Share your thoughts in the comments below and join our community of storytelling enthusiasts. We can't wait to bring you another unforgettable journey tomorrow.